Hi, everyone. This is Megan Evans. I am a behavior specialist with the MTSS SEL department in the Behavioral Health and Management group. My background is I've been a teacher, a school counselor, and a therapist. I've worked in a lot of trauma background areas like the Peace Grant and at Turning Point, and I was a teacher for day treatment as well. So welcome. Our goals for this presentation are to recognize the basics of school-based trauma responsive practices, to understand the links and overlaps between trauma responsive practice, restorative practices, SEL, equity, and positive school climates, and then to identify trauma responsive practices for ourselves and our peers. With COVID, we've really come to realize that this is a public health issue with regard to trauma. And so although we were planning this conference last year, this year has made it very clear that it's important. So I'm glad you are all here. I wanted to run through quickly just a few clarifications and definitions. When I talk about system, I mean the multi-tiered systems of support. So I'm not necessarily talking about the school district as a system or the community as a system, but really narrowing it down to our MTSS processes. When we talk about trauma and chronic stress, they're kind of interchangeable for this currently. Both affect our children greatly and both can be used interchangeably. Trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, and trauma-responsive are all kind of recent buzzwords around these practices. You'll hear me say trauma-informed quite a bit. That's just out of habit. I'm actually trying to train myself to say trauma-responsive as I feel it has a more proactive vibe to it. So you might hear both. I may even come in with trauma sensitive as well, just from readings I've done. They're all used interchangeably. And then we also talk about, you'll hear trauma-informed approach, trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed care, and trauma-informed school. Those are pretty interchangeable. There's some differences with regard to if it's in like a therapeutic practice or juvenile justice or medical centers. They're more nuanced, but in this case, I'm going to use them all, meaning the practice at our schools. So to start, I'd like to do a little mindfulness activity with you guys, just to get us here and grounded.
To guide you through a very simple mindful breathing exercise. It's very useful when maybe we're getting a bit stressed, a bit anxious, we're finding ourselves worrying or panicking in the day. We need to just connect ourselves back to the here and now, ground ourselves in this moment. So I'm going to invite you to sit up straight. Let your shoulders relax down naturally. And gently rest your hands in your lap. And let go of any tension in your arms. Just relax them. And you can either close your eyes or focus with a soft gaze on something in the distance. Now start bringing awareness to your breathing. We're going to be breathing in and out to the count of 4. So to start, empty your lungs. Breathe out, out, out. Empty them. And now breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4. And in. 2, 3, 4. And out. 2, 3, 4. And in. 2, 3, 4. And out. 2, 3, 4. Now let your breathing just return to its natural rhythm. When you're ready, open your eyes. Have a look around. Notice how you are here right now in this moment.
So hopefully that allows us all to kind of shake off the school day and our experiences today and be ready to be here. So looking at what is trauma, I know that we learned a lot from Patricia Jennings yesterday regarding trauma and her journey. in working on trauma-informed practice and trauma-sensitive practice. For us, I got this definition from SAMHSA because it covers a wide array of what can be seen or experienced as trauma. So individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. SAMHSA goes on to talk about the 3 E's, which is the event, the experience, and the effect. If we look at the event on its own, sometimes some of us will experience that as trauma, while others won't. So it's hard for us to know what is a trauma for our students unless we look at other things such as their experience of the event and the effect that that event had on them. This body of research is newer, but is growing very quickly. And at the end, I put a lot of reading and stuff in there for you if you'd like to read more. So when we look at trauma, why does it apply to us? And I know that Patricia brought up quite a few things in her discussion about trauma, but here are just a few that the Child Trauma NCTSN brings up. And if you look at those, I know there are a lot on a small page. You probably can recognize some students in your classes or schools that stand out a little bit when you notice these. And maybe those are kids that have experienced some adverse experiences in their life. And I'm sure there's many more we can add. Even in my own glancing at it right now, I'm thinking of like substance abuse, medical issues that then affect and impact attendance. So there's a lot to be said about how trauma comes into our schools. The good news is that we can help heal trauma. Tish talked about the ACEs study last night a little bit. And when that came out originally, it was very hard to hear, especially those of us that have a few ACEs, because they talked about all the negative outcomes. And with the research that's been going on, a lot of what we're learning is those resilience factors and how we can help heal ourselves and others from the impacts of trauma. The big ones: sleep, mental health, healthy relationships, exercise, nutrition, and mindfulness are critical for healing. There's a growing body of literature that is showing that these things are effective. I was on the fence with mindfulness in the beginning and keep reading up on it, and I'm now working on getting better at practicing it myself because of this research. So here is a little bit by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, a video to discuss trauma. She's done a ton of research in the area, and this quote is from her book, The Deepest Well, which Dr. Lamarca brought up yesterday, and is a great book to describe what's going on in the body of research for trauma.
High doses of adversity can change the structure and function of children's developing brains, their developing immune system, their developing hormonal systems, and even the way their DNA is read and transcribed. Those changes are what we now refer to as the toxic stress response. Okay, as a doctor, I may be the one who's screening for adverse childhood experiences, but I might see that child at the most, a couple times a year. But educators deliver the daily doses of healing interactions that truly are the antidote to toxic stress. And so the opportunity to do things like social emotional learning, to give children tools to understand how to recognize what's going on with them, and then how to respond, especially to be able to calm their bodies down, truly is healing. If you have a child who is being defiant, who is acting out, who is having a terrible time with impulse control, especially if they're experiencing high doses of adversity at home, suspending them so that they can go home and be in that environment may be doing more harm than good. We obviously need school safety policies and policies to support the orderly functioning of the school environment. But things like in-school suspensions, things like restorative justice, literally the time and space to allow those adrenaline and cortisol levels to come down. And it could be 15 minutes to have time and space in a quiet area to get back to self-regulation. That's a way to work with a child's biology instead of working against the child's biology. We have an overactive stress response. There's cortisol, there's adrenaline, there's all these stress hormones, and those are what leads to long-term harm. So I just went through the science and said, okay, well, what does the opposite? And it turns out that meditation, and I was skeptical at first, meditation helps to regulate the part of the brain associated with recovery post-provocation. It's associated with reduced levels of cortisol and other stress hormones, and also reduced physiologic indicators, things like blood pressure and heart rate. After reading that literature, I implemented a program in my clinical practice where we really taught mindfulness practices as part of our treatment protocol for kids with toxic stress.
So Dr. Burke-Harris and I have the same opinion of mindfulness. I forgot that part was in there. So as educators, there's no pressure here because we're already doing a lot of this already. I mean, watching that video the fourth or fifth time now, I'm seeing things that I see when I go in classrooms, things that students are practicing to help feel calm and regulated and ready to learn. So as educators, you guys are already dealing those daily doses of healing interactions that truly are the antidote to toxic stress. Personally, from my childhood, I'd make a shout out to Mrs. Voorhees and Mr. Masheri, who were my healing daily doses when I needed it the most in elementary and in high school. So educators are making that impact, especially in Washoe County. So when we look at a trauma responsive approach, SAMHSA discusses, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association, where they do a lot of research in these areas. They discuss safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, and voice and choice. When we look at our schools and how that transfers over by using Tish Jennings' description in her book, The Trauma Sensitive Classroom, we build supportive communities, we establish clear expectations, we respect cultural differences, employ consistent classroom routines and procedures, offer alternatives, practice emotion coaching, and establish backup support systems. As you notice, these are a lot of things we're already doing. And when we look at MTSS and SEL, these are things that we're already practicing in classrooms. The most important piece that you'll hear time and time again is safety and relationship. Students who feel safe in schools and feel they have connected relationships with adults who are giving them those daily doses tend to be more successful, even when they've had a traumatic experience or consistent toxic stress. So through MTSS, we have SEL, PBIS, and restorative practices. These are all inherently trauma responsive. In looking to fight for the change tomorrow, we need to build the resilience today. And that's what we're really working on with our students, is building resilience for them so that they become ready to be college and career ready and socially prepared. We look at SEL, this is their, I believe, new description, and it fits perfectly with trauma-informed practice. They advance educational equity and excellence through authentic school, family, community partnerships to establish learning environments and experience that feature trusting and collaborative relationships, rigorous and meaningful curriculum and instruction, and ongoing evaluation. And looking at our favorite pyramid here for MTSS, trauma-informed practice is a great foil over the top of all three tiers. As a quick reminder, tier 1 is 100% of our students have access to. And as we talk about things we can do in our classroom and things that we already do in our classrooms, primarily we're going to talk about tier 1 today. That should be enough for about 80% of our students. And 100% of those students have access to it. The goal there is to prevent harm, to keep people safe, to keep students respecting each other and others, and have a supportive and safe learning environment. When we get up to tier 2, we look at students who may need some outside of classroom supports and interventions, have a higher impact of trauma, and may need an extra nudge or some outside, staff in the school to help them. And then at the tertiary level, tier 3, we're often looking at supports for students experiencing trauma outside of the school setting. So the goal of MTSS is to create safe, equitable, and caring climates. Social emotional learning focuses on tier 1 school-wide supports to promote those 5 core competencies. And you can see that, again, these will overlap in that trauma responsive setting. The first one being self-awareness, the ability to understand one's own emotions, thoughts, and values, and how they influence their behavior. Next is self-management, the ability to manage one's own emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations and achieve goals and their own aspirations. Then we look at social awareness, the abilities to understand the perspective and empathize with others, including those from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and contexts. Relationship skills, establishing and maintaining healthy and supportive relationships, and effectively navigating settings with diverse individuals and groups. And then responsible decision-making, the ability to make caring and constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions across diverse settings. Within those 5 core competencies, the SEL program has 3 specific signature practices to use in the classroom. And so I'm going to share with you a video about those tier 1 classroom practices that are definitely trauma responsive.
Goal of social and emotional learning is to prepare students for long-term success in life and to become responsible, caring members of our multicultural society. So how do we make SEL a consistent part of every student's daily classroom experience, even when time is tight? Here are 3 simple social and emotional learning practices that can be built into any lesson plan to help create safe, equitable, and caring learning spaces for everyone, every day. Greet students with a welcoming inclusion activity. Then along the way, build in engaging practices to anchor learning, expand thinking, and actively practice specific SEL skills. Then end with a relevant, optimistic closure. When carefully chosen, well facilitated, and thoughtfully debriefed, the SEL 3 signature practices can establish a strong foundation for learning and an inclusive classroom community. They complement evidence-based SEL programs and provide opportunities for reinforcing explicit SEL skills instruction. The signature practices are aligned with culturally responsive and trauma-informed teaching and can enhance the work you're already doing with restorative practices, MTSS, and PBIS. When you design your classroom experiences to consistently incorporate the SEL signature practices, they become a powerful tool for creating engaging and effective learning. Why do they work? The SEL 3 signature practices are based on research that tells us that our brains crave both routine and novelty. Students learn best when they have predictable structures so they can be actively involved, collaborate, problem solve, and connect their school experiences to their own lives, interests, and goals. First, let's look at welcoming inclusion activities. They promote contributions from all voices, reinforce norms for respectful listening, and connect students with one another to foster a sense of belonging. A predictable routine helps establish a sense of safety and inclusion. Welcoming activities also provide a bridge into your goals for the lesson or school day. Some examples of welcoming inclusion activities are personally greeting every student, using their preferred name with accurate pronunciation, and engaging in a whole group greeting activity, such as a name game, or a morning circle, or an interactive experience intended to strengthen connections. Each activity works best when carefully chosen to accomplish an identified goal. For example, at the beginning of the year, you may choose welcoming activities to help all students feel known by their peers and build up skills for sharing and communicating. Later in the year, your welcoming activity may serve to recap prior learning, prime students for new experience, or establish a personal connection to a topic. Next, let's look at engaging practices that foster active learning, positive relationships, collaboration, and enjoyment. These practices are designed to help students stay focused and connected in their day-to-day learning experiences. Some examples of engaging practices include encouraging student input with open-ended questions, explicitly teaching skills for being a great partner or teammate, like active listening, problem solving, and empathy, holding 30 to 90 seconds of silent think time before inviting students to share out, turning to a partner to discuss, make sense of new input, or generate ideas, structuring interactions in partnerships, triads, small groups, and as a whole group, and teaching the components of collaborative learning. Engaging practices also include brain breaks, valuable moments to switch gears to integrate new information into long-term memory. The third signature social and emotional learning practice is the optimistic closure. At the end of each class period or school day, provide time for everyone to reflect on something that helps them leave on an optimistic note, feeling calm and centered and ready for their next experience. This signature practice reinforces student learning, provides a sense of closure, and contributes to feeling positive about returning to learn together again. Optimistic closure might be in the form of an exit ticket, designed to help both you and your students understand where they are feeling confident or in need of more support, or an appreciation connected to what they've learned or experienced, the way they've worked together, or for another person's contributions to the learning environment. Expand your repertoire to include many options to reflect the variety of situations in which you end your time with your students on any given day. Vary your thoughtfully chosen experiences to balance freshness with familiar rituals you create together that hold special meaning for your class. Use consistently. These three signature practices are keys to creating and sustaining a welcoming, productive, and collaborative learning environment that supports academic success for all. For information, examples, and templates for using the SEL 3 signature practices, visit our website. For additional resources on school-wide SEL implementation, visit schoolguide.castle.org.
I love that video as it includes a couple of great things that I already see in classrooms, such as giving compliments to students and practicing with students, giving each other compliments during those optimistic closures, as well as the probably explosion in the use of brain breaks this year, since our opportunities for the games that we used to use are not happening right now. So I've seen some great videos that I've written down to save for later, different ways the students have been able to practice new types of brain breaks. I was in a classroom where they ding a bell and all the students got to get up and go around their desk the number of times the bell was rung, and just different things like that to keep our brains moving and not getting kind of in the funk that we can all be leaning towards right now with this strange school year. So I'm going to move into restorative practices. These are intentional actions that encompass a range of practices which focus on strengthening relationships, building community, and addressing issues before they become bigger problems. The idea of prevention in trauma-sensitive practice is huge. If we can prevent students from feeling dysregulated, then we're preventing a ton of the behavior concerns that come up. If we can prevent students from having some of the struggles that they have and notice them early on, then their learning will be that much further ahead than it would be if we have missed those things. So restorative practices is a great way to integrate that. When we look at restorative practices, rather than looking at retribution as our response, we're looking at restorative responses. So rather than you broke a rule, you were bad, it's more what harm occurred and how did this impact the relationship, be it within the school, with another student, if it's social between students, or between the student and the teacher. Looking at what are the needs and obligations that arose from the harm, not just the cut and dry, you broke the rule, this is, you're in trouble, we're going to suspend you, but looking more at you did something that had an impact on your school system. It had an impact on the climate of your classroom. It had an impact on your peers. So really looking more for changing the student and helping them grow socially rather than looking at the student and having consequences and it being more fear-based. It's a hard shift, I know, and it's one that, I think we're all working on and have made our way through. With regard to restorative practices and trauma specifically, it's important that we look at all the opportunities to work with our counselors, our social workers, our school psychologists, even everyone in the building to help be restorative to our students and for our students. Again, providing structure and consistency. That's going to come up a lot because students, to have that sense of safety in school, the more structured and consistent we can be, although I know it doesn't happen all the time and stuff comes up regularly, the better off our students are. Easing transitions is part of that structure and consistency. Letting students know, okay, you got 3 minutes left to complete this, or there's going to be a change here coming up. I wanted to prepare you for it. And providing choice. Students who have experienced trauma have experienced a lack of control. They haven't been able to make decisions in their life often, and things come at them that they sometimes don't see coming or don't have any way of changing or protecting themselves. So giving them some forms of choice is hugely empowering, and also allows them, when there are times that they don't have control or choice, to feel okay about that because you have respected them through giving them that choice. Looking at our students, especially our ones that need the extra love and support, and developing their strengths and their interests. Developing those things that they're good at, even if maybe it doesn't look like your typical school-based skills, but looking for those hidden talents. Praising publicly and criticizing privately. And be careful of this because some students who've experienced trauma, they might not be comfortable with the public praise. Some of them are on the fence about that. It might make them uneasy. But just knowing your students and kind of keeping an eye out for how they react to that public praise, they'll probably give you some good clues if it's good for them or not. And then of course, criticizing privately, keeping private those times when you need to do corrections, talk to them about their behavior, talk to them about how maybe they didn't do well on an assignment. And then building connections, such as just being there. When they need someone or to check in. It doesn't mean to have that quote unquote open door policy. You need boundaries as well. But those times where the student feels they have the comfort level to come in and be like, oh, I'm having a rough day, or can I take a break, and being available for them if they need it, but also respecting if they don't. And then as part of our goals with SEL is teaching them what to do when they're overwhelmed, and teaching them what to do when they're overwhelmed in your classroom specifically, because that could look different from place to place. In looking at circles, I'm sure it's probably a mixed bag of people who have started practicing the circle process of restorative practices and those who haven't. But in looking at the process of circles, we typically start with every student sitting in a circle and just getting acquainted with each other. A socially distanced circle at this point, but talking about, answering some simple questions, getting to know each other, things like that. So there's a bond being built within the classroom where you're building that climate, you're building that relationship, which moves into the next piece of building relationships, where you're getting maybe a little bit deeper and discussing in those circles, what's going on in the classroom, maybe answering some higher order thinking questions, being mindful that students have the right to pass if they need to. And as you build that climate, then you can use your circles for addressing maybe issues in the classroom, problem solving, coming up with some action plans of things that, maybe too much paper towels are being used. So we need to talk about this issue. We need to discuss why we need to be respectful of supplies in the classroom. And then what are we going to do? What's our action plan? We're going to only pull down on the handle 2 times rather than 15 times, but letting that be a group discussion and a group decision. When we look at restorative practices, oh, my little tier 1, tier 2 thing disappeared. The first 3, nonviolent communication, restorative questions and chats, and community building circles, are all tier 1. Our restorative questions, I stuck down at the bottom. Hopefully this looks familiar to a lot of folks, but when there are incidences between peers or peers and adults, just going through these questions and kind of talking about, what happened? What were you thinking at a time for the student who has the behavior that's concerning? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you have done and in what way? And what do you need to do to make things right? These questions are fascinating for all levels of students, all ages. It's interesting what they come up with when they talk about what they need to do to make things right. And it's also extremely empowering. You're still holding them accountable for their behavior. They still have consequences. Those are things, you discuss with them. But this also gives them some time to really think about what occurred. And then on the other end of that, the bottom of the card is when someone has been harmed, what did you think when you realized what had happened? What impact has this incident had on you and others? And what has been the hardest thing for you? And then what do you think needs to happen to make things right? And sometimes this allows for students who maybe in the past would have, never talked to each other, or, it would have been big drama, to really keep it down between the two of them and solve the problem. At the top, we've got probably tier 2, which is responsive and harm circles. Those take extra training, which hopefully we'll be looking at next school year. And then this last one, I apologize, I don't know what happened, is restorative conferencing, which is a tier 3 intervention and is quite invested. Oh, there it is. Sorry, there you go. Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So in general, here's a bit of a review, and there's so many more of things we already use in our trauma responsive tier 1 supports. These are things I know I see in classrooms all the time. And sometimes for our students who are trauma impacted, it's upping those doses. So maybe we've fallen off in one of these and it's time to go, oh yeah, I was doing those circles and then we got busy. So I'm gonna try that again. And it's interesting to see what difference it makes to go kind of do your own little science experiment there where, okay, we were doing this. I'm not sure what the impact was, so I stopped, and it's been a few months, so I'm going to try that again and really look for differences. Look at how students are treating each other, look how you're interacting and feeling with students. So looking at these are all ways of dosing these students who need a little extra. Okay, so we're going to do a breakout activity. When you are in your breakout rooms, there'll be about 6 of you. And I want one person to just step up there and pick the order of people sharing to kind of create a circle in the cloud, if you will, and share out that order. And you'll go around in a group the first time and share your name and location and your favorite pizza topping. And then, not too deep of a discussion on if, pineapple should be on pizza or not, but a brief one. And then go around a second time and share what tier 1 strategies you're using in your settings that are trauma responsive. And for all of us, I would love for you to share those things in the chat so that maybe we can make like a huge list to share out so people can see how much you are already doing and share some ideas. You'll have about 8 minutes to do that. So hopefully you all have plenty of time. We'll put the directions in the chat so you can see those as well. Are we ready, Amy?
We are.
Sweet. And I'll see you guys when you get back. All right. I appreciate you guys doing that and apologize for any technical difficulties. We were trying to make it for 8 minutes and it was only giving us the option of 5. So hopefully next time we'll have a few more minutes. So an important part of trauma responsive practices is also classroom equity and school-wide equity. I know Tiffany will be doing her own breakout session with a deeper dive in this area, but I did want to point out its value and some important ways to do that in your schools and classrooms. First, focusing on preventative models. If we're using SEL and approved, research-based programs, we're pretty covered on those preventative models. Creating a culture of safety and respect, identifying those implicit and explicit bias, being acknowledging of privilege that can occur in the classroom for some students and not others, as well as ourselves as adults. And then taking time to look at data and identifying any patterns. I've done this before when I was working in specific schools to notice disproportionality, or if certain consequences were being given to certain students but not others, or just being aware of those things, because sometimes we don't do it on purpose, but we also don't notice that it's happening unless we're looking at the data and looking for those types of patterns. We want to be validating of the whole student. We have students that come from backgrounds and experiences and cultures that are very, very different from our own. And so sometimes it's hard to be understanding of those things when they're just kind of out of our realm of experience. So it's very important to listen and be validating of that whole student. Awareness of the impacts of disclosure on all parts. Disclosure is a very powerful thing. And what that means is kind of sharing something personal. So disclosure on parts of the student, disclosure on a part of staff or counselors or principals or teachers. It's all very valuable, but it also has to be very well thought about, especially from the adults. Disclosure can be bonding with students. If you share something about yourself, they feel more comfortable knowing you as a person rather than just knowing you as an authority figure, but also being aware of what you disclose. Personally, for me, this came up just a couple weeks ago in a social skills group I was doing, where we were talking about consequences and how parents give out different consequences. And in my disclosure, I shared that my son loses access to his Xbox when he has certain behaviors. And while most of the students were like, oh yeah, you know, me too, one student was like, I wish I had an Xbox, you know. And I realized in that moment I could have easily said electronics, which would have included like TVs or, you know, all the things that most students at least have access to one thing. But being so specific in what I said was kind of a trigger for him in reflecting upon his home life, which right now is very meager. So I know personally that's one I try to think about a lot. And then also not sharing too much. When students disclose to you, making sure you're aware of, you know, consequences of that disclosure, if it's something that needs to be brought to the counselor or administrator for safety reasons, but also being ready to hear what they might have to say. It might be pretty heavy and it might be pretty big. And being ready to be honest with them about, you know, what you may have to do in that case, and also being honest with them if it's a lot and you might need to refer to someone else. Separating the student from their behavior is a huge one. I don't think any of us want to be identified as that one bad habit we have or that one behavior we have. So remembering that our students aren't the sum of their behaviors or bad habits or academic levels, but that they're people. Ensuring that all students have a voice. This is a hard one. I mean, schools are set up where, you know, curriculum's decided, everything is decided. And so giving those little moments here and there, be it through circles or different things, is important because then students feel more invested in the process of education. And then last, being an advocate for all students. So you've heard me say it many, many times. Safety in relationships. I have a stack of books over here that are all on trauma and restorative practices and all those things. And they go back to that safety in relationships. The research is really strong in that area. So when looking at that, as educators, we all have these superpowers. But there's some things we've got to avoid that are pitfalls that commonly can occur without us meaning to do it or not. The first one would be inconsistency. Sometimes change happens, like I said earlier, but it's important to try to be as consistent as possible, to try to have the same process going on in the classroom so the students know what to do, when to do it, and have safety in that experience. And then preparing them if there is a change. Taking away supports for behavior reasons. Students who are dysregulated or may sometimes have issues with being dysregulated, you know, we sometimes have things in place for them to support them, such as like fidgets or a calm down space or a code word to, you know, do something different. And sometimes when students are having bad days, it's very easy to be like, okay, you can't have that anymore because, you know, you're being disruptive with it, or this, you know, things along those lines. So making sure that if you are changing what their supports are to keep them regulated, you're aware of the possible outcomes of that, and that you're also replacing them so that students can be supported and feel safe, even if it's by different means than what we're used to. Unintentional re-traumatization. This is a huge one because I know when we talk about trauma-informed schools or restorative practices, the word traumatization is stressful to us all because we don't want to be traumatizing, and we're not. For the most part, we're educators, we're supportive, we're here for our students. You know, there's reasons we go into this. And so what I mean by that is there are certain things that can be traumatizing for your students, and if you're aware of them, then trying to find ways around those traumas, you know, like changes in routine, giving them a heads up if something's going to be different, or, things along those lines. The rule of thumb really is to avoid consequences that trigger those feelings of powerlessness, fear, or shame. I mean, a lot of times you'll notice that students will really escalate when they're given like a verbal reprimand. And that's sometimes because they're used to having to stand up for themselves or fight back, and they go into that fight or flight brain. So if we can find other ways to correct them and work with them, like such as in the hall or, at a different moment, then often we don't even have the escalation or the behavior issues. Using knowledge about students, sometimes we hear some big stuff and you feel like you need to share it, and it's important not to. And it's also important not to use it against them, to like bring it up like, well, I know your mom left, or I know this happened, because again, and that in itself can be traumatizing if it's not done in the right way. Even if you're coming in planning on being supportive and caring, and it just hits that student in a funky way. Lowering expectations is a huge one. It's very easy when we go, oh, I know that kid has a ton of stuff going on, so I'm just going to let this slide. It's important that we keep our expectations high for these students. One, they know it when you lower your expectations for them, and by nature they'll either maybe take advantage of it, or they might be mad at you for it because they know that they can do these things. They just need the extra help. Again, that class-wide advertising of consequences. When students are feeling that shame in front of everyone, they're going to go into that fight or flight, and they're going to possibly do something to move the attention away from them or away from the negative. And then trying to include them in decisions. If you're making lots of decisions about one student and they're feeling out of the loop, especially our older students, that can cause some escalation for them. And then privacy violations, always keeping in mind FERPA and protecting our students and their privacy is very important. At this point, I wanted to do a quick activity with you, and I'm sorry I didn't write it out, and I meant to. So what I want everyone to do, wherever you are in the room, your room, is to take your hand and kind of make a circle. And put this circle somewhere in the room. Stretch your arm out as far as you can, and then look through the circle. And focus on what's inside the circle, not what's around it. And as you're looking, start pulling that towards your eye. And close one eye. Sorry, and start pulling that towards your eye until you can see through the circle. And I want you to notice the differences between what you can see when you're just seeing a portion through that little hole and what you can see when you pull it close to you. Typically, that's what we get with our students, especially at the beginning of the year. We might get a note here or there about, oh, this kid, you need to know this or that. But you're only getting like the smallest bit of information. And hopefully as time goes on, that's pulled towards you and you get to see a bigger and bigger picture about them. But my point here is that it's very important not to take personally some of the behaviors and actions that students come in the classroom or the school with. There's a lot going on that we don't know about. And sometimes we don't get to know about those things. I know that Patricia talked about it's not, look what you did, or, here's what you did wrong, but more, hey, what happened to you? But sometimes we don't get to know that. And when I was working in a therapy office for the district attorney's office, so there was some legal things, there was a lot we couldn't share, and there were a lot of things students chose not to share with schools. And they were pretty heavy, very heavy in some cases. And it was difficult, I think, for teachers and counselors and everyone to know maybe something's going on with that student, but they don't get to know what. So that's part of the reason it's so important that we use these practices with all of our students, because a lot of the time we don't know. So with regard to kind of not knowing everything and having these behaviors coming at you from students and and wondering where they come from. It's important to know that we are having experiences in those moments as well. Our own self-regulation can impact the outcome of an issue with a student, an intervention with a student. Children read from us if the situation is safe. Something happens or a student starts escalating, all the other kids are looking at you and how you're going to react. And they're deciding how they're supposed to feel in that situation based on how you're reacting. We'll have a better outcome if we're on a mentally good pathway and calm pathway. Self-reflection of where we emotionally are is valuable in those instances where it feels like things are starting to happen, kind of checking in with yourself and going, oh yeah, I'm feeling myself escalating, so I'm going to work on keeping it as calm as I can. Having our own triggers, much like our students, and our reactions is totally natural. We all have those things that kind of affect us or impact us, whether we want them to or not. I knew someone in day treatment who the pin clicking got him, and that's a small thing, but if you don't know that it's something that bothers you, you may not notice that your heart rate's gone up because someone's going clicky, clicky, clicky. As educators, we have extra pressure placed on us with experience of interaction by students looking at us. You've got families looking at what we're doing. We've got the community looking at us. And just like our students, they're getting a small picture or a small view of what is really going on. They may have seen the classroom for 5 minutes, or they may have talked to their one student and they have all these opinions, which can be stressful. So it takes work and practice to be mindful of our own experiences within these different difficult situations in the school setting. The thing that I have told myself for years, and I started it in day treatment many moons ago, was if I were given the same situation with the same knowledge, the same experience, the same supports, would I honestly do anything different? Whether it be the parent or the student or whomever, if I had that same knowledge, would I feel the same way? And I know we like to think, no, we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't act this way. But I could never be 100% sure. And that was what kind of kept me calm and regulated in those moments. So finally, some tips on self-regulation. If you have strategies that re-engage you in the moment, using those strategies, I'm happy to share some, and maybe I can put that on the website we have going. Taking a self-assessment for self-awareness, which I will give you guys as well, looking at basically what are my triggers? What are things that get to me in the classroom? What are things that I know that happen that bug me that I may need to acknowledge and let go of? In situations where we do feel escalated, we have students who are behaving more out of their trauma than out of just regular behavior. Checking in with yourself. How am I feeling right now? What am I experiencing? What do I need right now? And if this is happening a lot in your classroom, coming up with a plan with others to support you and help you when those situations escalate. And after those situations, again, debriefing what happened. What are my feelings about that? My thoughts about those feelings, and then the internal script. The internal script is important because I think we're all raised with our own scripts of how you are supposed to be in a classroom, how you're supposed to behave to adults, how you're supposed to, do this in a grocery store, all these internal scripts. And when we see people that aren't doing what we're assuming is common behavior, common knowledge, it can trigger us. So for example, looking at if a student's sleeping in class, what happened? The kid's sleeping in class, my feelings. I'm mad, they're sleeping in my class. What are my thoughts about that? This student is clearly disrespecting me because they're sleeping in class. And my internal script is kids who sleep in class are disrespectful to their teachers and don't want to learn. And that may not be the case. that student may not have slept the night before. They may have been watching younger siblings. They may have had a crisis in their home, may have had law enforcement in their home the night before. So it's important to be aware when those internal scripts pop up. And finally, make sure you're taking care of yourself and your own needs, and you're getting help and support when needed. So thank you guys. Please share in the chat any questions you have, because I think I'm about out of time. But I'm happy to answer them. I'm happy if you look me up, mmevans@washoeschools.net, to answer any other questions or share anything else. And I appreciate you guys all coming.